Hi, this is Dan Watanabe, and welcome to Backward Engineering Your Script. In previous episodes, we've talked about the whole idea of what kind of writer are you? Are you a writer of stories? Are you a writer of characters? Are you a writer of scenes? And then we've also discussed what kind of project you should write for your first script. Should it be something that's genre, or should it be something that is more personal? Well, today we're going to do the first part of the actual backward engineering, and that is to figure out who your audience is, because knowing who your audience is a very vital component to how you're going to actually write your script. And I know this sounds like a limitation, and in all honesty, yes, it is a limitation, but that's a good thing, because once you have a limitation, you have an ability to figure out a way around it, how to take that limitation and make it into a positive, how to make it an actual virtue. If you think about a lot of classic movies, this is exactly what Hollywood did during the production code era when they weren't allowed to talk about certain subjects. And what did they do? They kept them there anyway. They just called them something else. You mentioned that someone was, oh, you know, she's a dance hall girl. We all knew what that little naughty meant. Or, oh, she's a showgirl. We knew what that meant. Or, he's someone who's a confirmed bachelor. We understood that that meant he was never going to get married because he was going to become one of those people who lives with his uncle in a house down the road. As two confirmed old bachelors, rather like Cary Grant and Randolph Scott did for a while in the 1930s. Anyway, when I say figure out who your audience is to know who is going to be your highest and best viewer, is to understand how to write your script, how to build it toward who that highest and best audience is. For example, let's say you want to do something that's very, very personal and very intimate. Your highest and best audience is probably going to be an art house audience, or it's going to be an independent film audience. In other words, it's going to be something that's probably going to be a challenge to sell. That doesn't mean you don't do it, but it does mean you have to be very consciously aware of how much can be spent on it. Therefore, when you're writing it, you're not going to write it with 1,000 different locations. You're not going to create it as something where you're going to have a nightmare in post-production because you have people doing overlapping dialogue. Probably going to want to do something that's more akin to a European art film. Secondarily, your highest and best audience might not even be something for a sale in that case. You might be doing this as a showpiece. So if you're doing it as a showpiece, your actual final output doesn't need to necessarily have as much of a commercial bend to it. Let's say you're doing a genre. In particular, you want to write a horror script. That's probably where most people will want to start. The challenge with doing a horror script is, once again, budget. Because horror movies, at their highest and best, tend to be those that are done on a lower end. And that's because that grittiness that comes from the independence adds to the overall impact. There can even be things that are hybrids. Let's say, for example, you want to do an action, and you still want it to be low budget because you want to do it on your own. Well, the trick about an action movie in that case is that it must have the unique elements that make an action movie sell, which is, number one, you have to have a character who's a rebel. Number two, you got to blow something up. Number three, you're probably going to have as many people as possible take off their clothes in a way that's not quite pornographic, but definitely will look good in the publicity posters and on those online sites that you're not supposed to know about. Now, this doesn't sound creative, yet, again, it's important to understand that that is part of the creative process, to know who you're going to ultimately get this to and what your ultimate career goal is. If your career goal is to remain independent and somebody who does their own thing, then you're probably never going to be paid the multiple millions of dollars. But you have set yourself up to have a hit that will give you the power to have the choice of moving into the studio realm. I think back on Steven Soderbergh when he was writing Sex, Lies, and Videotape. Now, in the early part of my career, I worked at the company that started Sex, Lies, and Videotape. They ultimately didn't finish it because it wasn't going to work for them. But I saw the process and the thinking that went on behind the scenes. The movie was started by a company at that time called Musafilm, and it was run by Mike Curb, who was Mike Curb Singers, and he was, at that time, had Lyle Lovett and the Judds on his label, and they just brought Belinda Carlisle in. So his name, because he was also lieutenant governor, meant that there had to be a certain higher level to what he was doing. And something called Sex, Lies, and Videotape did not fit with the company profile. But Steven Soderbergh, as an inveterate movie lover, as someone who was a walking encyclopedia of not only film history but film technique, was determined to stay close to his vision. And Morgan Mason, who was one of the partners at the company, took it to RCA Columbia. And RCA Columbia at that time had a home video label that was very lucrative, and they felt they could do the movie for $1.2 million. Now, Steven Soderbergh understood that because of that, the movie could not be done under the auspices that he wanted to originally do it, which was to shoot it in black and white, which was to mix media, sort of the way the Blair Witch Project would do a decade later. And that would not work for RCA Columbia. So he softened the material. He not only softened the material, but he was able to engineer it somewhat to make it attractive to stars. Whereas before, the primary motivation of it was to attract it to a more rough crowd, to the NC-17 crowd, so to speak. That process also got him to hone in on making his characters more likable. So the script went from being something that was very, very, and I hate to use this word, but I can't think of a synonym, edgy, to being something that had the sense of edginess without ever crossing that line. And it ended up having characters that we could bond with. And we all know what happened. That movie was a huge sensation internationally. It ended up making over $100 million on that $1.2 million investment. That gave him the power to move not only into the mainstream, but have that most wonderful of careers. The ability to do something that's completely independent, but at the same time, juggle that with something that was very commercial. And once he did Erin Brockovich, you could see him doing that mixture, the very commercial Ocean series, mixed with movies like Che. So he was able to achieve that. So it's important to understand where your film fits, not only in the Hollywood universe, but where it fits within your own universe, what it is you want to do. There's a lot of people who've been completely satisfied doing nothing but low-budget films. Somebody that I went to USC with is a guy named Ken Sanders. And he and I always loved crazy lady movies, like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, Lady in a Cage, Bloody Mama, Who Slew Annie, the list goes on. And he knew that that's the kind of movie he wanted to make. Now, who is the only person really in Hollywood today who buys that kind of movie? You're right, it's Lifetime. And during the course of his career, he's done over 50 movies for Lifetime. And every one of them is a little gem of that kind of crazy lady energy. So he understood what his talent was. He understood that it wasn't going to be something that was mainstream. And he now hires old actresses in the same way Robert Aldrich did when he did Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. He hires actresses who are no longer in high demand and gives them an opportunity to really shine. And yes, sometimes the movies are not necessarily high art, but just like the early Roger Corman movies like Crazy Mama, they are a joy to watch. When you see some of his movies like Accused at 17, no, it's not something where you're expecting someone to give an Emmy Award-winning performance, but you know that 20 years later it will have that same wonderful cultish quality that something like the TV movie The Stranger Within or Steven Spielberg's early movie Duel had. So think about your career. If you want to step into something that's bigger, a bigger budget film, maybe the trick is to do something that is very, very strong in character, even if it is small. When I was in distribution, we saw a cute little movie called Jersey Girl that ended up being bought out and then completely remade as a bigger budget feature. And it's interesting how that can happen. So think about who your highest and best audience could be, but also think about what your highest and best strategic position for your project is. Again, I'm going to come as the bias for being an independent filmmaker, probably genre-oriented and most likely on the low budget end. But we will be discussing how to plan your career strategy overall in future episodes. Thank you very much for listening. This is Dan signing off.